to be able to respond to any number of emergencies, you have to be prepared for them. Every organization, I would expect they have some sort of emergency preparedness plan and looked at the potential business impact and conducted some level of training.
Welcome to the RANE podcast series on security with Brian Lynch. Today's podcast is about business resiliency using communications, emergency preparedness, and response. Brian's guest is Terri Mock, Chief Strategy Officer at RAVE Mobile Safety, a critical communication and collaboration platform. Let's listen.
Today I have the pleasure of having as my guest Terri Mock, who is the Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer for RAVE Mobile Safety. And as we will be discussing business resiliency through emergency preparedness and response, I want to welcome Terri to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's good to be here.
Terri, we were speaking the other day about the increased risks we have seen in the past 2 years or so, not only involving COVID-19, but in violent crime, etc., across the nation, and frankly across the world, obviously with the Russian-Ukraine war. Let's start by talking about those risks and the importance of emergency preparedness and response for companies.
Sure. As you mentioned, today's threat landscape is full of challenges. All of us are kind of combating and coming out of COVID with the focus diverted from pandemic response to more to business resiliency and business continuity. And of course, the consideration of like the shift back to the office or hybrid or remote work. So that's caused, the whole pandemic has caused significant amount of mental health stress and burnout. So that's clearly one of the considerations for many businesses today. And then you mentioned also a rise in threats and disruptions from more frequent and intense weather hazards to escalations in disruptive events such as cyber attacks or supply chain interruptions to, I think we've seen an increase in mass shootings and acts of violence. So combined, with these types of hazards and threats, there's certainly a need for emergency preparedness and response these days. So I would agree with you that the need to reconsider, employee safety, training, and reviewing those operational plans and preparedness plans is something we should be considering more.
Yes, and I heard you say in the past that the emergency preparedness and response plans and training and the infrastructure around that for companies supports not only the company's operations, but most importantly, their employees, right?
Yeah, I mean, that duty of care to your employees is paramount. As you're running your business, your key resources are your people, your assets, and your operations, and all of these come into play, making sure that your employees feel safe at work, and that your operations are running as smoothly as possible. All of those are aspects of being prepared for any sort of emergency or crisis.
So having noted all of the issues and the threats and the risks that are out there, as you rightly pointed out before, in support of your clients, having said all that, what keeps you up at night? What specific area gives you cause for pause?
Well, really, when we talk with our customers running their businesses and operations, they're concerned about many of these types of threats. It includes from day-to-day medical types of emergencies that can happen if someone got injured on a location, to cyber attacks, whether the security protocols are understood by all if there's a breach, to any number of measures in terms of something as terrible as an active shooter, to just more severe weather types of incidents, if you need to consider hurricanes, tornadoes. So I think in this, as companies and businesses are considering these types of threats, risks, and emergencies, they think about who needs to know if one of these threats are happening and what to do about it. So this aspect of communicating as soon as possible the dangers that are imminent, or when you become aware of them, and then taking the right types of actions to protect your people and your assets in operations. That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a great segue into the next section of our discussion today, which is how important it is for the critical communication and collaboration needed in order for any one of these events or incidents to be properly managed. Can you go into a little bit of detail about how it is, how critical communication and collaboration is when an event occurs?
Well, as you know, if you think about, when disaster strikes, when an emergency happens, when a crisis takes place, there's the phase of just acknowledging and knowing that, and that's triggering a certain response. The quicker that you inform your various teams, the emergency response team, your leadership, 911, first responders, and emergency management, if it becomes that significant, your facilities, the better able they can handle that crisis. That situational awareness of knowing what's happening, that becomes key. So that initial phase of the first minutes, the first seconds, minutes, hours of response is really critical in terms of a crisis activation plan. And then as that crisis develops, the ongoing updates to let people know what's going on becomes important. So over time, whether you need to tell your employees, your partners, or others, the public, of what's happening, and even through your recovery stage, as business comes back to normal, that level of coordination of the various response teams, the level of communication internally and externally becomes important.
Yeah, that's a great point, Terri. So is it fair to say that that speed matters, and the quicker someone may know about a situation, the quicker they can take actions to make themselves safer, the more positive the outcome is?
For sure. And there are, various protocols and tools in place that can support that. And the faster they act, the more prepared they are. So obviously, to be able to respond to any number of emergency, you have to be prepared for them. And for, every organization, I would expect they have some sort of emergency preparedness plan where they've gone through and assessed the risks and looked at the potential business impact, and then put together sort of like a business continuity plan, a crisis management structure, and conducted some level of training or exercises to equip their response teams, but then to equip all their employees if things were to happen. The better prepared you are, the better able you're to respond. The quicker you respond, the better your outcomes are. So a large part of responding to these crises is your preparation and your capabilities to respond.
Yeah, let's go a little bit deeper. You're speaking to the FEMA's phases of emergency management, and I've heard you say in the past that the 4 tenets, which are prepare, respond, recover, mitigate, are critically important to get those better outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about each one of those and a little deeper dive about employees and companies, what they can do in the left of boom, if you will, the preparation piece. Why is that so important?
Obviously, being prepared for any emergency allows you to have the tools, technologies, and protocols to appropriately handle every type of incident. And a critical communication system, such as a mass notification system, or a mobile panic button, or some employee safety app, also allows for that notification process. you want to make sure that these systems and lines of communication are available so that they should be part of your emergency preparedness checklist. And you ask yourself questions of, do we have a crisis communication plan in place? Do we have the communication system tested? Do we know who is responsible for which aspect of the response so that they can be appropriately notified? And so all of these are aspects of being prepared. And then related to that are the protocols and guidance that are put in place. Many companies have binders of checklists, and if it's an active accelerant, you look at a checklist of locking down your facilities. If it's a medical emergency, you have a different checklist. If it's severe weather in terms of different types, you have different checklists, and you have usually like a call tree. But what technology can do, what a mass notification can do, is kind of get you through those automated notifications and appropriately, provide that immediate identification of an issue and get your response teams actively engaged, whether it's security personnel or your leadership, your employees or your facility managers, so that they can take appropriate action.
Your points related to left of incident or left of boom in the preparation phase, you mentioned tools and technology, and then the protocols which are in place help companies to respond. But as you noted, it's critically important that all of this is properly and timely communicated. How does that then, from the preparation to the response, how does the preparation and response influence recover?
Right. Well, as part of your preparation, you want to make sure that you have the ability to segment groups and send them the types of alerts and messaging that they need in order to respond and quickly restore operations to normal. So your facility team might need to know where the incident happened, any information about hazardous materials in the area or things like that. So with the ability to segment amongst your groups the types of alerts that are relevant and the information that they need to respond appropriately, that helps you to then get to recovery faster. The ability to collaborate during a response, having two-way real-time communication, also allows for the coordination of the multiple teams involved. That may include 911, EMS, fire, law enforcement. The ability to all be on one conference bridge. That allows you to have constant updates of what's happening on site, who's doing what. A checklist of roles and responsibilities. So it's clear that who's taking on any given task, who's closing down the roads, who's informing, the fire officials, who's meeting them at the gate, and then the accessibility of the repository of information of contacts data or floor plans or hazmat procedures, and having that available on your mobile phone so that as you're checking out equipment or checking out your facilities, you have that level of information on hand. That all of those things allow for the awareness that you need and also the guidelines of how to respond. And that gives you the ability to respond better and then recover more quickly.
So as I hear you and our listeners hear you, it's the right message at the right time to the right people in order for the response and recovery to have the best outcome. And then that recovery period leads to mitigation. And how does a well-oiled machine, if you will, on the recovery tenet of this emergency management process? How does it influence the mitigation side?
Well, certainly at recovery is when you start to bring everything back to normal. You take stock of where your employees are. You're getting them the medical attention they need if they need it. You have an assessment of, what's impacted in your facilities. And with that, you can provide updates to your employees so that they know what the extent of the situation is, whether they can return back to the office, and how long that duration may be. You have this all recorded, so if you have the appropriate tool, I mentioned a mass notification tool, but if you also have a crisis management tool, that provides you a record of who's doing what at all times during your response efforts, during your recovery efforts. That allows you to understand how you could be improving in the future, so that in terms of mitigation, you can do an after-action review of how you prepared, how you responded, how you recovered, and then finally how you could mitigate for future incidents. And it may show you that you need to improve your communication templates that you're sending out alerts, that you may have missed certain teams or sub-teams in terms of the notifications that they needed, that some of your protocols need to be updated based on the learnings of this incident. So there's this kind of closed loop cycle of improving on your overall emergency preparedness and response plans for future incidents and better outcomes.
So the communications piece really crosses all of these areas. And I've heard you say that it is really a full circle structure on communications that lead to better outcomes. It's kind of like the spine of the entire planning process. So if I'm a company and I'm listening to this, what are the critical areas that I should focus on to select that enabling technology, as you noted, as part of the preparation phase, which includes the tools and technology? What are those enabling technologies, and what are the criteria that companies should be focused on in its use and selection?
Sure. For critical communications, you would need a mass notification tool that gives you quick, reliable communications and notifications to your teams. They need to be able to target specific groups, as we've mentioned, and they need to allow for two-way communications and also geo-targeted communications. You could have a system throughout all your facilities, but if the incident really only impacts one of them, you want to be able to direct those notifications just to those impacted. We spoke about the ability to provide conference bridge types of capabilities so that the responder teams can coordinate efforts. And then in the heat of the moment, what's really important is ease of use. In just 1, 2, 3 steps, you should be able to have your message based on your template. You just check it out. You make sure that the modes of communication, whether it's text, email, voice, via social media, that you could quickly check off which modes would best reach your targeted audience. And then you want to be able to make sure you have the list available of who should be notified for each type of alert. And then in those 3 steps, you can then send your communication out. So that quick 1, 2, 3 ease of use is especially important when you're dealing with, when you're in the heat of the moment. Now, related to that is just an understanding of, is there any automation that would be helpful depending on the type of incident, so that if there's a call in for an active shooter, immediately there's an automation of various authorities that need to be called, your corporate security team, a notification for lockdown across your employees. So a crisis management tool that allows you to sort of automate notifications by incident type would be useful. One that lets you just digitize your emergency response plans so that you can have these checklists of tasks that needs to be done per type of incident would be extremely helpful. They're situation specific, but yet they give guidance. And the protocols can then be followed, yet give you the flexibility to adapt to each situation. And then, of course, you want to record and track the responses and actions so that you can review your after action, so you can improve further, and in some instances for compliance sake. So the combination of technologies of mass notification and crisis management tools, that provides you with that speedy communications, yet the operational flexibility to adapt to a given situation, but accountability for actions and tracking of progress, and then keeping everyone coordinated and in the know of what's going on to quickly get to a resolution, to quickly bring your people, your operations back into normal operations.
Excellent points, Terri. And as you and I have spoken, communications is the key. And I think where we have seen some responses that have been below expectations, it's probably related to the manner in which communications were either able to resolve or provide information timely to those that needed it, or it wasn't able to do that on a timely basis to the people that needed it when they needed it. That's critically important, as you know, in a crisis and in these types of incidents. One area that I'd like, the communication process, as you have rightly pointed out, is important in getting it right for the crisis events, the incidents, the security incidents, etc. But a best-in-class communications process or structure can also help companies in other ways. Can you talk a little bit about how important the ability to utilize this system, the communication systems, the mass notification system, is something that can be used in frankly, everyday life?
Right. What we found is many businesses are looking for a mass notification tool for those types of crisis events and emergencies. But as they've used it and applied it in their operations, they found that there are a number of ways that they could use it on a day-to-day basis. And these we call more of operational messaging. It could, during COVID, for example, we had customers use it for employee COVID health checks. We've had HR teams use it in order to give information about, HR enrollment periods. More importantly, it's often used to provide, site notifications, where there are road closures, for example. And so there are, even for drills that are conducted or safety types of training, you can send some notifications there. We've had manufacturers and other healthcare organizations use it in terms of staffing for shifts. And so there are a number of other types of uses that make it something that you're familiar with on a day-to-day basis. So should the event, something happens on a crisis, you're familiar with this system and you can use it moving forward. And it's very familiar to you. So it's making sure that your employees know which are emergency types of communications and more of the operational, and you can make that very clear and distinct. And then you can allow different parts of your organization use it in different ways to communicate and engage with your workforce.
Yes, Terri, an important point. And the everyday use, obviously, the mass communication system needs to be proficient in a crisis and an incident, no question. But the everyday use is an important component part of it as well, because it may assist organizations with defining what that return on investment is. It's not just used, hopefully never, but maybe once a year. It's used throughout the needs of the organization on a day-to-day basis. And let me ask you this. So you've talked on today about a lot of different areas and specifically some of the criteria that companies should focus on in selecting or using a mass notification system. I'll throw this out, and I'd love to have your comment on this. One of the criteria that you touched on was ease of use. And if it's not easy to use, it probably doesn't get used. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I actually do agree with that. It has to be reliable and easy and performant for that type of incident. As we discussed before, it needs to be the right message to the right people at the right time, and you need to ensure that with that ease of use.
And if it's easily used and trained to, and not only the administrators who are proficient in it, but anybody else in the organization that needs to use it finds it's easy to use, then it gets used not only in a crisis, but also in everyday use, as you noted. And I think that's one of the more critical components when companies are looking to make that decision or change from one system to another. How easy is it for anybody who needs to use it? And I think you've noted the other examples and how important it is, not only for a crisis incident, but also for everyday use. Let me ask our final question, Terri, on today's podcast. What is it about your technology that will provide these criteria that we discussed today?
Sure. I think that as a company, our mission is in terms of safety, right? We believe that keeping communities, organizations, and businesses safe is paramount to enabling them to run operations and run their businesses, and that the technology we provide enables for that. So what we look for is we started with the question of what keeps you up at night. As you're running your organization, if you're in risk management, emergency management, corporate security, HR, in a leadership role, what kind of things keeps you up at night? And how do we address and enable you to make sure that you're doing everything you can to protect your people, to keep your operations running? And with that lens, that's how we build our technology, that it's matched to your needs and the pain points that you have. So all the capabilities of being performant, being reliable, being easy to use, getting the right message to the right people, which means the ability to segment groups, to geo-target groups, to have targeted messaging, to be as prepared as possible. So to have templates in place, to have checklists that are digitized to enable you to respond better. All of those are in response to helping to support this emergency preparedness and response process, so that every phase of preparation, response, recover, and mitigation, that we're providing the tools and technologies to help you do that as easily as possible. I think that as a suite and as a platform of tools, that enabling technology supports our customers and allows them to derive the ROI and the benefits from it.
Thank you, Terri, for joining me on my podcast today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Terri Mock is with RAVE Mobile Safety, the leading provider of critical communication and collaboration technology used to save lives, manage crisis incidents, and increase resiliency. RANE offers risk intelligence solutions to more than 400 leading corporations, government agencies, and academic institutions. They turn to RANE for risk intelligence that cuts through the hype to focus on what they need to know, what to expect, and what to do. Learn about us at ranenetwork.com. Thanks for listening.